Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the written page on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, and I'm coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee, here in the United States of America. And today we have a guest who's coming back to the show after a few years. We spoke about John Lennon and the final months of John Lennon last time. He wrote a really interesting book about that topic. He's an author and editor of more than 30 books about popular music, about the Beatles, including this excellent two-volume two-volume biography of Sir George Martin. He's back on the show because this year, 2026, marks the centennial of George Martin's birth, and he's accepted my invitation to chat about George Martin on the podcast today. He's a professor of English and popular culture at New Jersey's Monmouth University. I'm not sure if I pronounced that correctly. Monmouth University.
Well done.
Uh, with a PhD from North Illinois University. And if you are interested in the Beatles and you read about the Beatles, you certainly know him. Ken Womack. Ken, thank you for being here and welcome back to the show.
Oh, so good to see you.
How how have you been since the last time we spoke? It's been a while.
Well, I'm staying busy. It has been a while, but there's no better occasion to get together and talk about Sir George.
Yeah, absolutely. His is a figure that has always fascinated me. And listen, it's interesting. 2026, sorry, is an important year as far as centennials are concerned. Not only the centennial of the birth of George Martin, but also the centennial of the first recordings by Bing Crosby is a favorite of mine, and that's why I mentioned that. But also the centennial of the birth of Miles Davis and John Coltrane and Tony Bennett and Julie London, country singer Ray Price, whom I met years ago in Nashville, and also Chuck Berry, who was very important also for the Beatles. So it looks like 1926 was a great year for music.
Yeah, I'll say that's an incredible company there for George Martin.
Now, you've written not the book, but the books on George Martin, and I'm wondering, what was your first memory of hearing the name of George Martin? Did you realize then how important he was for the music of the Beatles, or did that come later?
I think like a lot of people who fall in love with the music of the Beatles, it came later. I would see his name, obviously, because I would run to the liner notes like other listeners. And I recall, um, eventually getting to the point where I wanted to learn more about him. What does a producer do? What is their debt to him? And, once you lift up the hood on the life of George Martin, you realize pretty quickly that it's extraordinary, and that their relationship with him was not the norm in terms of um, how pop music acts tend to engage with their producers. And George Martin was just as hungry, if not more hungry, than they were for success. I mean, he had a chip on his shoulder. He, of course, was masquerading as being someone from a finer class than perhaps he was. And so there was a lot on the line for him, and that probably was one of the reasons he was the perfect producer for them. He had skin in the game.
Mhm.
If they had ended up with Mike Smith at Decca back in uh, early 1962 when they had that failed Decca audition, I think that Mike Smith, uh, and I say this without being critical of him, wouldn't have come at them with the same level of imagination.
Mhm.
He would have done what most producers do, which is to try to take the Mersey beat sound that they had, the beat band sound, and just translated that to their first record.
Mhm.
George Martin had much bigger things on his mind than, crafting them just to sound like a better version of what they already were. He wanted, as he called it, a fireproof act.
Mhm. How do we begin to explain this level of imagination that George Martin had and that you're mentioning. Because, prior to producing the Beatles, he had very little idea of rock and roll and this new music. It was a different type of record that he was producing for Parlophone. But where does this creative imagination come from in the case of George Martin?
Well, it was really kind of foisted upon him when Oscar Preuss retired in 1955, and that left George as the kind of de facto head of Parlophone. Um, he probably would not have been promoted by his superiors at EMI if they weren't already thinking about mothballing the operation. They were thinking of cost-cutting measures and maybe getting rid of Parlophone altogether. Might have meant that George would have gone as a member of the team, perhaps with one of the other labels, the other, HMV or Columbia. We won't know because George, of course, came in and really made some hay with the comedy, right? And
Mm,
spoken word. But what he did when he made those records that's so interesting, I think for our purposes, is that he used the studio, as he said, as this kind of impressionistic laboratory for creating, and I stole this for one of the titles, sound pictures,
mhm,
pictures in sound. And it was really a brilliant idea. And the idea of thinking about it fully as a creative space, it was what recording artistry always meant. It's just George was activating it. So I think what he was doing was very portable. And even though the Beatles were a very different kind of act than Peter Sellers, you go back and listen to those Peter Sellers recordings, and they have all the hallmarks of Beatles recordings. I mean, they have sound effects. There's layering as much as he could accomplish that given the status of the equipment. Um, they have a lot of panache, humor, which the Beatles, traffic in themselves. It's really a great match. And he had done the work to learn how to use, in particular, Studio 2 at EMI Recording Studios, now Abbey Road, to make that happen. So he had kind of unknowingly perhaps done the prep work uh, so that he could be the great producer that the Beatles needed when they came along.
mhm. In fact, some of those early records that he made for Parlophone, that he produced, sound a lot like the Beatles Christmas records that they sent out to
That's
the
right.
fan club, or I should say that the Christmas records sound a lot like those early records that he produced. But I've always wondered, coming from the background from which George Martin came, how did he mm, become a producer? Because he was interested in music from an early age, different types of music. But how do you go from, or how did he go from his interest in music to his interest in actually producing other people's records?
Yeah, I mean, that was not his lifelong dream. His dream was actually to be in aerospace engineering. I mean, the chances of him actually doing that from his station as a boy were probably far more limited than he would ever have known. But he was excited by the idea of playing the piano. I mean, that's what he loved to do.
Hmm.
It was the one real skill that he had. And it was during the war when, his fairy godfather, as he liked to call him, um, kept making opportunities for him. It was really quite amazing when you think about it that George was able to leapfrog from really being more impoverished than any of the Beatles ever were into the kind of social stratum where he could be successful and even have a chance to be something called a record producer, which of course they didn't call him that. He was the
Mm.
A&R head, the artist and repertoire head, as it were. of the label. But um, the reason that was able to happen was his war years. I mean, that made all the difference for him, right? He goes off to war. He hears the fancy voices and the really great table manners of all these young officers in training, who are his betters, and he realizes that, you know, my gosh, these are the guys I want to be, and so he begins changing himself. But it's Sidney Harrison is the fairy godfather. Sidney was a pianist. He was a faculty member at the Guildhall School on the south side of the Thames. Sidney Harrison also had a radio show. He was a player, and he and George would exchange ideas through the mail. During the war years, it was Sidney's way of giving back. He would give George pointers on his notation. Eventually, when George returns from the war, Sidney says, "Well, hey, why don't you go to the Guildhall?" George would never have thought something like that was possible. Obviously, Sidney had the wherewithal and the influence to make it happen. And then later, in his third great moment for George Martin, Sidney will help arrange an interview at Abbey Road at EMI with Preuss.
Mhm.
So I mean, Sidney is just talk about right favored status. George was very privileged because of this one guy. I mean, there's even some doubt that George didn't even finish really his coursework at the Guildhall School because this job came up and George needed to work. I mean, he had a wife, and they were living, hand to mouth, as it were. I mean, when George rides to his interview, he takes a bicycle to his interview at Abbey Road,
Mhm.
and he wears his Fleet Air Arm, his Navy greatcoat.
Mhm.
I mean, that's the only coat he has. I mean, you
Well,
know,
that's really one of the revelations from that first book, Maximum Volume, that I found fascinating when I first read it, because you often think of George Martin as in a very class conscious Britain of the 1950s and 60s. I would even say it's still very class
well,
conscious
of
as
course.
opposed to other countries. This man looks like somebody from a higher class than the Beatles, but once you read the book, you realize, well, this is the way that he presented himself is something that he learned to do. And, I find that fascinating because it changes the view of a person who was privileged because of his birth, which in his case he wasn't, to someone who was able to present himself in such a way that he was able to find better opportunities for himself in his personal and professional life.
Yes. I mean,
So,
it's a great way of looking at it. Um, I think George had difficulty while living. I can't speak for him now, but I think he had difficulty dealing with what his own life looked like, right?
mm, mm.
When you look back, I think that people are often, we're the worst judges of our own world in a way, because it's a mess when you look at it, right? It's easier for other people to think linearly
Mhm.
and more cogently about our lives than ourselves. I mean, it's just this morass, right, that exists behind you, and it's happening so fast in a way.
Mm.
And I was talking to the great Beatles historian Mark Lewison about this,
Mhm.
and about George, and he said, "Well, the part of the challenge with George is he's just so constantly busy.
Mm.
He is so throughout his life from beginning to he's really just always was busy." There's a great moment toward the end of his life. One of the London papers wanted to check in with him, and they sent a reporter up north to his estate. And when they got there, um, George wasn't working on music anymore. He couldn't hear. He was making model airplanes,
Mm.
and he wasn't just making them. Had thrown himself fully into making, the best damn model airplanes you can make. It was so interesting but that's how he rolls, right?
Yeah, that's really impressive. As impressive as also his knowledge of music. What musical influences did George Martin bring to the table as a producer in those early years of the Beatles? Besides, of course, the comedy records and all the studio know-how that he acquired.
But I always butcher this name, which is sad because I was first horn in the orchestra growing up. But Debussy,
Oh
right,
yeah. Hmm.
was his favorite
Hmm.
for sure. Um, we have his practice notation when he was at the Guildhall School, and he did several of those pieces. To teach himself how to do adaptation and orchestration. Those were certainly his favorites. Um, he developed a real taste in the 50s for soundtracks. In fact, had the idea that that's the business he was going to end up going into. He will do a few soundtracks, but he thought this was going to be the place that he really branched out into before the Beatles came along, and kind of turned all that on its head. But yeah, as far as influences, he was as he used to say, he was a classical guy. You
Also, a little
know,
jazz, maybe, right?
a little bit of jazz, certainly, but at the end of the day, he's classical. He, yeah, one of his first number one song is by the Temperance Seven.
Hmm.
You're Driving Me Crazy, which your listeners, if they listen to nothing else, Mr. Lewison compiled a beautiful edition of all of George's early work, and that one just it'll blow your ears off. It's wonderful in the sense it starts off with what a tuba is right up front, and that tuba, sounds like it's in the room with you. And right there, inherent in those recordings is what makes the Beatles great. The care that George put into, making those recordings as pristine as possible really made all the difference for them.
Maximum volume, as they say on the title
Yes, right. And
of
he
that
didn't
first
just
book.
mean, yeah, and he didn't just mean play it loud,
Mm.
right? He meant making sure you can feel the experience of the song and the instruments. And of course, having a good team around you is what often makes the difference. And for him, that ends up being a guy like Jeff Emmerich, right?
Mm.
Who understood George's aesthetic and his approach to music. And so, when you've got a song like, say, The End, where Ringo's doing that amazing solo, Jeff sets up the microphones so that you can feel the maximum volume of the solo
Hmm.
right there in your chest, right?
And this is more important than it looks because in the 50s and early 60s, British producers were, usually in awe of what American producers were doing, and they kind of rated themselves lower than American producers. And I think that starts to change with groups like the Beatles, the Stones, etc. And I think George Martin is very important when it comes to that. But he was already doing that before, as you mentioned, with the Temperance Seven and some of his early records. He was very conscious of sound and the volume and the quality of the sound, which I think it's not the case if you listen to records, by Johnny Kidd or by Tommy Steele or by, some of the other early rock and rollers in England. That changed with the Beatles, with the Stones, and later on. And I think he's important in that sense as well.
Right. He elevates the whole discussion, right? I mean, it's thanks to them that, in a way, they light a fire behind people who are already visionaries in their own right. But I think, in particular, of Ken Townsend. George Martin made a great impression on Ken. They started the same day at EMI, and it was because of George that really Ken started looking for ways to create more innovations for the studio, whether it was the direct injection boxes or ADT, which is artificial double tracking, being able to, um, loop two 4-track recorders to give them more space together, or later, right? The folks behind the TG 1 2 3 4 5, the 8-track desk for Abbey
Mm-hmm.
Road.
Mm-hmm.
They may have still felt like they were behind the Americans, but what was happening in terms of technology, particularly at Abbey Road, with the kind of folks that they put together, was making a big difference, and it will usher in the great album age of the 1970s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is such a tremendous era, no matter how you look at it, for all these players.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Pink Floyd,
absolutely.
right, comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's interesting to note that in 1962, when George Martin first encounters the Beatles, he doesn't seem to be very impressed with them. But what is it that eventually attracts George Martin to this band from far away Liverpool? Because at the time, Liverpool was further away than ever from London, right?
Sure, and politically, when you think about them, they're a terrible choice for him. Yeah, here he is trying to leapfrog his way into a higher station. Why would you strap yourself to some Liverpudlians?
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't. I mean, that's why he said to Brian Epstein in their first meeting, Liverpool, you're joking. Yeah, come on. No, that's not the pathway that he's looking forward to. But they save themselves with him on June 6th of 62 when they get together, and they're just hilarious,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, George knows how to respond to comedy, and they had it in spades.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, really from that point forward, he was open to them. But then there's the magical moment later that fall when they fight for Please Please Me.
Mm-hmm.
He's trying to dismiss it out of hand. He says it should be faster. Well, how would they have known that? But they listened to this, what they thought was this old man. He was what, 36. They listen to him, and they go back to Liverpool and they play it fast. They do what he says. They rehearse it. And I really, from that point forward, he never doubted them again.
Mm-hmm.
He won them. They won him over, and they won him over by working hard. And of course, there was amazing panache to all of their recording, to their music, to their songs. That they would bring in with these incredible arrangements. His job was simply to nurture them, and of course, no one, even them, would believe that they would, like a rocket, right, go from those early primitive songs to Rubber Soul, Revolver, Pepper, White Album, Abbey Road. I mean, no one can see that coming,
Mm-hmm.
and so quickly, But George Martin set those conditions that made it happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
He built the
absolutely.
conditions, especially in those early years when he barely had access to them because Brian had them playing every two-bit wedding he possibly could. I mean,
Yes.
if there was a way to make money and milk the Beatles bandwagon in those early years, Brian was doing it, and he should have been, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
flashes in the pan were real, and who knew what the shelf life of a rock band would be. Um, but George really took advantage of those moments and learned how to use them. So by the time they get the help, he's ready to start playing some cards, studio musicians, getting them to elevate their sound. And, you know, for me, he's the catalyst that makes that happen. They have the talent. They're the ones coming in with these incredible songs and
Mm-hmm.
this raw material. If you listen to them as musicians, you can tell that their abilities as guitarists in 1962 are going to be far overshadowed by what they are at the end of the band's life in August 1969.
Mm-hmm.
So that all belongs to them. There's no doubt about it. But everybody needs someone to help set the conditions for
Mm-hmm.
growth to take place.
And besides setting those conditions, which is no small feat, of course, Ken, uh, what would you say were the major ways in which George Martin left an imprint on the Beatles music and on the Beatles as a band, but specifically on their sound and the kind of material that they played, because it's obvious that in just 3 years, there's a huge change in the sound of the Beatles when we get to Help and then Revolver and Rubber Soul. Um, how, what kind of an imprint do you think, and in what ways did he leave an imprint in their sound?
Well, firstly, it was good political thinking. He knew probably long before he employed folks from the Royal Philharmonia that he was going to do it someday if he could. It was just he was always very careful with them to sort of parry and thrust, right? He would wait until the moment was there before he would necessarily float some ideas. And the wind-up piano technique that he used is a good example. He used it early on with what was it, Misery
Hmm.
on Please Please Me. Yeah, they weren't that impressed. So he waits a good while before he brings it back, A Hard Day's Night, and he blows their minds, right? I mean, his technique elevates that song considerably. That's a big moment for him. He went in the door then, and he comes back with the work on In My Life with the wind-up piano. Um, it's now part of their repertoire at that point. And at the same time, he brings in the string quartet for Yesterday, the flautist for You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. These were all really smart, calculated moves. He wasn't
Hmm.
going too fast for them, So by the time they get to Revolver, they're open to all sorts of adornments, a French horn, the brass on Got to Get You Into My Life.
Hmm.
By the time you get to Sergeant Pepper, bring in the orchestra, right?
Hmm.
And what I think is really spectacular about the way he uses those studio musicians is twofold. One, he gets the best people on the market.
Hmm.
It's London, so he brings in the best people. The Beatles, it was sort of like what Brian was doing for them with their finances. He would have the best minds, from the London School of Economics. And here you've got George Martin bringing in the best players probably in the world to play on Beatles records. But I said it's twofold because it was also the way he recorded those
Hmm.
musicians.
Hmm. Hmm.
When you go back and listen to them, they don't sound like just a simple superimposition where the band doesn't seem to be playing in the same room with these guys, right? There are
Hmm.
lots of examples you can find of orchestration where it just sounds like somebody took I think there's a recording like this that's in my head. The Carpenters, right? And took their orchestration and sort of grafted it onto the band, and it doesn't feel like they're in the same room.
Hmm. Hmm.
It feels artificial and plasticine. George was so good at making it not feel that way. You really felt like it was a true collaboration that the Beatles are sitting here with this orchestra. We know they're not. I mean, on August 15th, 1969, which was orchestration day for Abbey Road, I think only Harrison was there.
Yeah.
But it was that illusion.
Hmm.
That illusion makes all the difference, because it feels like this cohesive recording.
Hmm. I think it's part of
I'm the
that.
walrus, right?
Is that
With
part of
the
that synergy? I
scream.
think. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm the walrus, which a song that initially he didn't really cotton to. He just goes to town with that and writes this incredible score, and it just washes over you.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting that, it's not that the roles are reversed, but when I talk about this synergy, I'm talking about this two-way dynamics that you find between the Beatles and George Martin. George Martin gives some ideas to the Beatles, especially in their earliest records, and he plays some of the instruments on the recordings. But then the Beatles started relying on him to make their ideas happen in the studio, right? So they suggest certain things that they want, and they rely on George Martin to come up with the technical know-how to make that happen. And I think that's absolutely of paramount importance when we get to the era of Revolver and Sergeant Pepper's and so on.
Absolutely. It makes all the difference, and it's, again, a lot of that is George being a great politician. Now, there are going to be moments of lapse
Hmm.
that really cost him influence. He was not smart to take that vacation in 1968 for three
Hmm.
weeks. I mean, he left the wonderful Chris Thomas in charge, and things went along swimmingly, and Chris is just excellent. But that meant George missed 3 weeks of influence with the
Hmm.
band,
Hmm.
including very crucially the Twickenham session where they made the videos for Hey Jude and Revolution,
Hmm.
and that's when the ideation occurred for the Get Back project.
Hmm.
I love this example because I remind my students that this is why you show up.
Hmm.
And George had that momentary lapse, and it cost him a little bit, right? Um, in the coming months with his Fireproof Act.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree. That is interesting, and actually, that goes a long way to explain his absence from the Get Back,
Yeah, it's
later Let Be
instructive.
project, right?
Yeah, it's instructive, and it's just a good reminder for folks about why you show up. Now, George does show up.
Mm.
He realizes the lay of the land pretty quickly that, Glenn Johns is the man, is the guy. Um, and he's a smart politician. He makes friends with Glenn Johns. They end up working on those endless Get Back mixes together throughout 1969. George is smart that way. He does go to a lot of the sessions, both at Apple Studios and earlier at Twickenham.
Mhm.
Now, part of it is if he shows up, he can invoice them because by then he's in business for himself.
Yes.
He's smart that way. Um, but he plays it really well. And by the time they get to Abbey Road, they're like, "Hey, George, let's do it." So he comes out of it very well.
Yeah, I
But
agree.
those missteps in 1968 are interesting.
Yeah, that's an interesting era for him and also for the band. When they start going, their separate ways musically, and writing songs without really much of a collaboration anymore. And George Harrison starts becoming more and more important as it pertains to his own compositions and that kind of thing. So that is an era that really, to me, is fascinating because he still has a certain influence, but not as strong as it had been before. And by the time we get to Abbey Road, he wants to make sure that he can go back to being in charge, so to speak.
Yeah, and he plays it really, really well. Life is two things. One, change. There's going to be change in
Mm.
life. And secondly, um, you've got generative issues as people grow up and grow older.
Mm.
It's not going to be the same as it was in
Mm.
1962. Um, People grow up, they have relationships, children, etc., and the mix will keep shifting. And so
Mm.
George understood this. By the end of the Beatles, he has what, three children, I
Mm.
believe, three or four. So he understands implicitly the nature of life changes. And the Beatles are going through all of that. They just happen to be these four people making an extraordinary music that will last the test of time.
Mm.
That's just the irony. But otherwise, everything else is very much about life and living. But by then, George has figured out that, a great producer works with that.
Mm.
And he's so good at massaging the material with Abbey Road and bringing that project
Mm.
in so beautifully.
Mm.
Because it is, I know this is the argument in social media, what's the best Beatles album, and all sorts of discussion. No matter how you look at it, though, their artistic vision has come to and reached a final fruition with
Mm.
that,
Mm.
and George deserves so much credit for making that happen in such a powerful way. I mean, so much happened in post-production with that record.
Hmm.
Alan Parsons, Jeff Emmerich, but I mean, Alan did a lot of that work that made that record sound so good. That
Hmm.
was Alan Parsons. It's just like movies, right? It happens in post-production. A lot of amazing work happened in post-production with Alan Parsons, and of course having the new equipment for that record. But you got to have somebody directing the proceedings, and that guy was George Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, there is a change, as you mentioned, in recording equipment, which is important because, there was so much more that George Martin could do with the Beatles after they stopped touring in 1966 and became studio bound. Not only because the Beatles had more time and could spend more time, more expensive studio time in the studio, creating the songs and recording the songs. Not It was not just the time that they had, but also the improvement in their recording technologies that allowed George Martin to use that to his and their advantage. How important do you think that is from, let's say, 1966, 67 onward?
Well, it's extremely important. One thing we want to keep in mind though is the space was cheap.
Mm,
EMI owned the studio outright, so they would create accounting to talk about,
mm,
the studio time. But uh, thanks to that very fortuitous aspect that the Beatles were with EMI, who owned their own studio, that wasn't
mm,
always the case, right, in the
mm,
60s.
mm,
So what it meant was they did have that carte blanche, as you just noted, to be able to work in there relatively inexpensively, especially relatively inexpensively if you think about the return that
mm,
EMI is getting on
mm,
those sessions is off the charts,
mm,
right? The only cost is maybe the opportunity cost of not being able to nurture other EMI artists
mm.
during the same time. But they probably didn't care.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because you go with the hot hand, and that's what George Martin was doing. Um, but what George did so well, and what EMI did well, although they hollered and moaned a little bit along the way, was they kind of grew with the Beatles,
Mhm,
right? That's what I tell young faculty now, or when we hire them. University life. The best jobs are the ones you can grow with,
mhm,
because you're not going to want to do the same things 15 years from now you're doing now. You want a job that grows and changes with you. And George Martin, and to a certain extent EMI, were very good at creating this space so that they could grow. And as George Martin himself said, in that case, once we built the conditions, they grew like hothouse flowers, is
mhm,
his line.
mhm.
They just um, they set the conditions, and the Beatles flowered like nobody else.
Hmm.
Um, but that's what you do when you have something great, or you're in the presence of greatness. You nurture it. It's why we tell our students, I'm sure you do too, you're really good at this thing, then do that.
Mhm.
What do you need to do, not just to continue doing this thing that you're amazing at and gives you pleasure? How do you get better at it?
Mhm.
Right?
And on top of that, you need to learn to recognize what you're not good at, because that also helps.
Yes. Right. And the person who was very good at that actually in the Beatles miss was John Lennon. He would
Mhm.
say, we're not directors. Why do we think we're directors? Just because Paul says we can make Magical Mystery Tour, we're not those guys. We're
Hmm.
good at this one thing. We're really, really good
Hmm.
at this, and so that's where you put your energies. That's right. That's such an important admonition when you think about
Now that
this.
reminds me of two things, Ken. One of them is you mentioned that by 1969, um, George Martin was basically working for himself, and so he could bill the Beatles if he showed up. That goes back to 1965, and that time when, for different reasons, George Martin decides to leave EMI and start working for himself. What are the reasons behind that, and how did that affect George Martin as a producer, if in any way?
I mean, I don't think it affected him much, other than he just didn't feel as badly about himself. He They were holding him down at a pretty low salary. What was it, 3,000 pounds or something?
Mm,
Um, in 1962. I mean, my father was working for the Shell Development Company and was making more than that.
mm,
And George is studio head.
mm,
He's head of Parlophone, right? I
mm,
mean, label head rather. So that probably they EMI was cheap, and they were keeping everybody down. Everybody made the same salary, allegedly, right? Everybody made the same salary, so it didn't incentivize, people to necessarily strive beyond their station. And
mm,
this made George mad, and he became even more angry in 63 when he had one of the best years of anybody in the history of the business,
mm,
and he didn't even get the bonus that his girlfriend slash secretary got.
mm.
He thought that was amazing. They're like, no, yeah, you don't get one. You're a label head, come on. You're administration, So,
You have the
um,
title. That should be
yeah,
enough.
and George was competitive. He played a really lovely man, and he probably was in many ways, but he also was extremely competitive, and this pissed him off. So, as soon as he could get out of that contract, he did. He has a very gratifying moment in 1969 where they try to hire him back for 36,000 pounds,
Mm,
which was obviously, 12 times the salary he left. He didn't take it. Um, he wanted to continue investing in himself. It was tough going, though.
mm,
He's trying to run a business in one of the most expensive real estate meccas in the world, and that's London.
mm,
That Oxford Street studio, which became quite the location for a lot of musicians, um, was extremely expensive to operate and ran a huge debt load. Um, and It was tough going
mm,
for several years. Eventually George is going to see some magnificent paydays, including, ironically, the Sergeant Pepper film with Frampton and the Bee Gees,
mhm. Yeah.
which he'll be musical director for. But um, he was very headstrong and driven, and he wanted to do it for himself,
Mm,
and he did. Of course, eventually creates Montserrat, which billions of dollars worth of pop albums are made in the 80s there. Just
mm,
literally billions of dollars of output.
mm,
Is staggering. What he created. Tragically, of course, it's destroyed by storm and volcano.
mm,
I think it gets hit twice, but during its heyday, he built something really magnificent
mm.
in his industry. So, that was due to his headstrong nature.
I
But
that,
that's what makes the Beatles so wonderful, right? Is they had this guy who curated them so thoughtfully and forcefully. When you listen to those recordings, and then inevitably listen to recordings by their contemporaries at the exact same moment, sometimes even at Abbey Road,
mm,
the Beatles are streets better.
mhm,
Not just because of their talent and the songs and the musicianship, just the recordings. I
mhm,
mean, George really curated that band.
mm.
They all put so much energy into that project for as long as they possibly could, and that's part of the greatness of the Beatles.
And it often sounds to me like even George Martin himself put a lot more effort into those records than those by, say, Jerry and the Pacemakers or Billy J.
Oh,
Kramer and some of Matt Monroe, whom he also produced, and some of the other people that Brian Epstein brought to him. Simply because he recognized that there was a huge difference in the quality of their, talent, their musicianship, and their songwriting.
yeah, he had, I mean, like we all do, he had a passion for what they were doing,
Mm.
and he saw it through.
Which reminds me, since I mentioned Brian Epstein, I wanted to ask you, how was the relationship between George Martin and Brian Epstein, and how did Brian's passing in 1967 affect George Martin?
Well, they developed a real partnership. They saw themselves, rightly so, as guiding these guys. They're really young. They weren't even in their 30s when they broke up. In August of '69, nobody was 30 yet. And so, they put a lot of energy and effort. George was absolutely distraught when Brian died. It just cut him to the quick. They were very close. Um, like John Lennon, he saw it as a really bad omen
Hmm.
for what might happen next. So he was just crushed by that death. It was a really horrible summer for Brian. I mean, for George, he lost his father before he lost Brian.
Hmm.
His father died, I think, during the week they were working on All You Need Is Love for the international telecast. So it was rough
Hmm.
going for him. But Brian, I mean, it gutted him when
Hmm.
when they lost Brian.
Hmm.
Um, it's remarkable that they held it together to get to the place where they could end so fluently and so powerfully with Abbey Road.
Hmm. After diving deeply into the life of George Martin for these two books, Maximum Volume and Sound Pictures, which are right here, and I show to the camera again, I'm wondering if you think that there was a Beatle in particular with whom George Martin felt more attuned musically.
People like to say that it's McCartney. Um, and of course, circumstantially, they all work together
Mm.
extensively again, and especially in the 80s. Um, but I trust George's own words, and uh, because he did understand himself, maybe not his past, but he did understand himself very well, and he knew, one of the tricks of the trade for him was going with the hot hand. And if that hot hand was John Lennon, that's where he went,
Hmm.
right? If Lennon comes in, when Lennon comes in with Strawberry Fields, run through that door, right?
Hmm.
He just had a great intuitive sense of how to go with the hot hand and head arrangement, right? How
Hmm.
you how you put together a song, how you structure it. Those were his talents. He made a good point. Brian didn't like this, but Brian would say George is the magic in the studio. He can take any artist and create a number one act. And Martin didn't like when he said that. He said, you
Hmm.
know what? That's not true.
Hmm.
It's true with the Beatles, but they're the Beatles, damn it.
Hmm.
I mean,
Hmm.
it's really all about the talent you're working. He didn't like being this kind of, he's the kingmaker.
Yes.
He thought Brian was wrong about that. And I think he's right that Brian was wrong about that. George
Hmm.
could not make any act a number one act. But his tools that he had, his skill set, played perfectly with the four lads from Liverpool.
Yes, I agree with you, and I think that it is borne out by, the records that he made, especially in the first part of the first half of the 1960s. The records by Jerry and the Pacemakers, by Billy J. Kramer, while maybe not as good as the ones by the Beatles, they're still really good records. A lot of
Great
them
records.
have stood the test of time, in my opinion.
Sure. George, though, was, he recognized that they were a different cut,
Hmm.
right? So um, he made a point of noting that, I mean, he didn't love not Jerry, Billy J's
Hmm.
voice.
Hmm.
And he would do a lot to mask uh, different parts of his register that he didn't like. So he felt like he had to do a lot of workarounds, with those guys. And of course, when it came to sinking or swimming and not having Lennon and McCartney material, they kind of, slipped
Hmm.
away. He wasn't able to sustain them. He wasn't even able to sustain
Hmm.
Cilla Black,
Hmm.
So um, he was smart and astute enough to recognize once he recognized he was in the presence of that fireproof act, he ran with it as long as he
Hmm.
could.
Hmm.
And I mean, I think that's ultimately our lesson from this is knowing to do that.
Hmm.
In life, we get so busy. I think we miss that sometimes. And George Martin almost missed it.
Hmm.
He almost missed it, but he got that glimpse right there in the fall of 1962 that kept him coming back, or he might very easily have just recorded those six sides and moved on his way.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And also, since I asked you about who he was more drawn to musically, which one of the Beatles do you think he was drawn to more personality-wise? Like, do you think John Lennon because of of the absurd comedy that he favored, or maybe?
I don't know that. I don't think I would put too fine a point on this. I
Mhm,
really think he went with the hot hand. I mean, there's that lovely moment in the Get Back, the Peter Jackson Get Back, where Ringo's on the piano and he's playing
mhm,
Octopus's Garden. It's a charming little song. The next thing you know, both Georges are over there working with him
mhm,
and they're helping him to shape it. That's how Martin operated.
mhm,
And I spoke to people in later in his life who knew him in his small village. And, he would nurture people that way. He would go up and help them start, making something of whatever they were doing. I think that's what he did very well. He just knew to, like I said earlier, to parry and thrust, to move
mhm,
into the fray when necessary and back off when not.
mhm,
I mean, the first time he heard about Tomorrow Never Knows, they had a meeting. And of course, at the time, they were even thinking of recording with somebody else in the United States at Stack Studio. So George had to be very smart in those meetings to make sure it went his way, which it does.
mhm,
But when they brought up Tomorrow Never Knows and he heard about it, he was sort of did this thing with his chin and said, "Well, that's interesting." You know, he just played it smartly,
mhm,
and then let them surprise him. He wouldn't have known how to do that 5 years earlier,
mhm. Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, you're right. Let's talk about the books. Maximum Volume, The Life of Beatles producer George Martin, the early years, 1926, 1966, and then we have Sound Pictures from 1966 to 2016. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I would like to discuss the books a little bit. I'd like to know a little bit how this project came about, and also the reasons why you decided to use 1966 as the cutoff date for Volume 1 and Volume 2. Volume 1 was published, if I'm not mistaken, in 2017, and Volume 2 the following year. And I've read these books several times. In fact, I've reread them to prepare.
Oh my God.
I mean, I
So
did. I wouldn't say several times from cover to cover, but I do go back to them often to find information about this or that period. But then I did read both of them in preparation for this conversation with you, and so I'm really interested in how the project came about, how you went about doing this. Research for this really mammoth project, and
so
the reason why you chose 1966 as the cutoff year for the first volume.
sure. So I was working on, I think it was 2014, and I was having lunch with the head of Penn State University Press, who unfortunately is now deceased, wonderful guy. And he said, this is a great idea. And my idea was to look at the Beatles from the lens of the person who was their first audience, who got to hear these great songs in their raw state. Well, that's George Martin,
Mm,
right? And so that was my premise. And Patrick Alexander, the great, as I said, head of Penn State University Press, said to me, "Well, you need to get an agent. You need to do this one different." I said, "Okay." So I did that in short order. I lined somebody up, and it was going to be a single volume. We got to the point, though, where we realized that George's story was much longer than the word count that the press wanted to deal with. So um, that's the reason it stops in 1966.
mm,
It felt like a good cliffhanger moment. They have all that struggle to bring Rubber Soul into being, right? It's kind of a comedy of errors there at the end, right? Just getting that to the marketplace. But then, of course, it's so wonderful when they do. So Um, that was just the natural stopping point for a book that was
Mm,
running way too long.
mm.
And the idea was actually to do three. The third volume would have been called Swan Songs, but the press wasn't having it. So the problem was that meant eliding over a lot of the post Beatles material that I would
Mhm.
have said a lot more about. But it was fun and it was exciting to sort of see the world from that point of view for a while. And for me personally, the big change is it's altered the way I think about teaching them,
Mhm.
and the way I present the material in class. Usually a couple times a year, I teach a Beatles seminar to music students, and so it's changed that kind of perspective that I use.
In what way has it changed? Because that's very interesting to me.
Well, um, I'm looking from the inside out as opposed to the outside in,
Mhm.
if that makes sense. So when it came time a few years ago uh, to blowing up and rebuilding my slides during COVID, right, which was right after those books were finished,
Mhm.
um, I then used that philosophy in creating my approach.
Mhm. Yeah. That definitely is interesting, and really these two books to me are the books to read when it comes to learning about George Martin. He wrote his own books as well, but this is just a fantastic, outstanding biography in two
Well,
volumes
I
of.
sure appreciate your kind words. And I did have benefit of something George didn't have really in his time, and that was access to a good timeline created by
Mhm.
Mr. Lewison and others that enabled me then to correct some of, George's memories were a little shaky,
Mhm.
as
Mhm.
all of ours are, right? And so I did have that benefit of being able to go in and reframe some of his own timeline. But again, you could do that with anybody's life.
Well, of course, George Martin will be remembered for his work with the Beatles, but I wonder if there's any other collaboration of George Martin besides the Beatles that particularly stands out to you. Maybe a collaboration that is not as well known, because, of course, we've
Yeah, I
talked.
would, I would, I would give you two. One would be he did great work with Jeff Beck there
Mhm.
very briefly in the mid 70s. That is worth a listen. It really is because he really managed to get a lot out of Beck and create what may be his best record. Um, but then also America, I think he extended
Mhm.
the life of that band.
Mhm.
They kind of broke with their first producer who had made their name with their biggest hits in their early years. I think George helped them to extend their life. And in fact, they're very grateful to him now. They still talk about him. They're both living about, the way that George came in and kind of gave them a new lease on life so that they could
Mhm.
find and extend their sound in later into the 70s. So that was really important for them. Those are two excellent collaborations. The third is it's not obscure at all, but it's Mr. McCartney.
Mhm.
We're always talking about what's the best McCartney album. You hear Band on the Run and now Ram a lot. It's
Mhm.
it's neither of those. It's pipes. I'm sorry. It's Tug of War.
Mhm.
It's a remarkable album. It's an absolutely outstanding record, and it's one of George's best productions.
Mhm.
It's just remarkable. A Pipes piece is good too, but it's an extension of those sessions. It's really Tug of War is one of his greatest concoctions. That record is staggering.
I love tug of war, and I think more work needs to be done about discussing the work of George Martin with the Beatles after the breakup of the Beatles, because I think some of the work he did with them was, in my opinion, not just tug of war but other records as well, very interesting. And of course, the importance of the work with the Beatles when the Beatles were the Beatles, really obviously overshadows all of that to such an extent that often we tend to forget that he kept working with them individually after they broke up.
Yeah.
Final question, which just has to do, Ken, with any kind of work that you're doing right now. I know that you have finished a book that we're really looking forward to, and I just want to give you a chance to just let the audience know what it is that you're working on right now and what's in the works for, the next few months or maybe for the next year.
Sure. So it's all about Mal Evans right now,
Mm.
and it's volume two, which will be Mal's memoirs, will come out later this fall. He wrote several 100,000 words, and it's time to bring those along with more of his photography and artifacts to so folks can ferret out their own Mal Evans stories. I was hoping to publish the diaries with them. The press, understandably, balked at the idea of going with all of those memoirs and all of the diaries. So I'm working on formulating a way to get the diaries out so that people can have access to those in total too.
Hmm.
So that's the front and the back burner.
Yeah. And you teach a Beatles class at Monmouth
I do here at Monmouth.
once
I
in a while.
teach, I'm in both music and English. And for music, I teach the Beatles in the fall and Bruce Springsteen in the spring. Our new Bruce Springsteen Center for American Music building will open in 3 months. Um, yeah, just 3 months, fewer than 3 months now at this point away, and it will be open for business. So that's very exciting. And then the other part of my appointment is teaching grad students in creative writing in
Hmm.
English.
Hmm. Well, I look forward to reading the new Mal Evans book when it comes out. It's always interesting to me to talk to people who teach at the university and they teach something that I am passionate about, but that I don't teach myself. And so I always wonder how students, receive the Beatles so many years after their breakup, like new fans that obviously were not there when the Beatles were popular. Some of whom were born after the passing of John Lennon, but the music of the Beatles remains current. In what way, Ken, would you say?
When they come into class, it's interesting the difference with those two courses. With the Beatles, they come in for them. They already love the Beatles. They're
Mm-hmm.
music students. They inherently understand and intuitively understand what makes them great. They just want to know more,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so that's the mission in those cases. With Mr. Springsteen, it's often they love Bruce because their parents do and they want to
Mm-hmm.
feel closer. But with the Beatles, it's just the discovery will never change.
Mm-hmm.
People hear them, they fall in love, and they gotta have more.
Mm-hmm. That's part of the timelessness, I would say.
That's the whole thing.
Well, no better way to celebrate the centennial of George Martin's birth in 1926, this year of 2026, 100 years later, than by looking up maximum volume and sound pictures. And no better way to celebrate it either for me than having a chance to talk to the author of these two books, the great, because he really is. I've read so many of his books and I've followed his work for so long that it's always a pleasure to have him on the show. Ken Womack, thank you so much for being on the written page, and good luck with everything. And I look forward to talking to you. Hopefully, not in a few years, maybe more like in a few months.
That would be awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, and this is the end of our broadcast, the written page. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez. Recorded this in the middle of the month of March of 2026, the centennial of George Martin's birth, and our um, guest has been Ken Womack. Please look up his books about the Beatles, about pop music, about George Martin, and we're just signing off right now. If you have any questions, any comments, leave them underneath the video, and it'll be a pleasure for me to respond. And this is it for now. Signing off, Anton Garcia Fernandez from Jackson, Tennessee. This has been a new episode of The Written Page with our guest, Ken Womack. Thank you, Ken, and see you next time.